Ethan Miller never imagined a single sentence could shatter 6 years of marriage. But that night, as the argument spiraled out of control, Sarah crossed a line he never thought she would dare touch. She mocked the fact that he was adopted, twisting his deepest insecurity into a weapon. Her words didn't just hurt. They broke something inside him. Ethan walked out of the house without looking back, the sound of the door closing echoing like the end of everything they had built. Outside, in the cold silence of the night, he realized the marriage had been dying long before this moment. Money fights, disrespect, constant tension, he could endure all of that. But this was the betrayal that forced him to confront the truth about his past and the family he never knew. And for the first time in his life, Ethan decided he would search for where he truly came from. Ethan didn't sleep the night he walked out. He sat in his car for hours, staring at the empty streets while Sarah's words kept replaying in his mind like a cruel echo he couldn't shut off. He had heard hurtful things before during their arguments, but nothing had ever cut as deeply as what she said that night. All his life, Ethan carried a quiet fear that maybe he had been unwanted by the people who brought him into the world. He rarely talked about being adopted because he knew how vulnerable it made him feel. Sarah knew that too. And yet she used it anyway, throwing it at him like ammunition meant to destroy. He kept hearing her voice, sharp and mocking. Maybe your real parents dumped you because they didn't want you. Each repetition made his chest tighten until he felt he couldn't breathe. The more he replayed it, the more he realized that this wasn't just another argument. It was a breaking point. When morning finally came, Ethan drove to a nearby park and watched the sunrise without really seeing it. He tried to make sense of everything that had happened, of the marriage he had fought for, of the woman he once believed he understood, and of the growing emptiness inside him. He asked himself when things had shifted from love to resentment, from partnership to constant battles. He thought about the small moments he had brushed aside. Sarah mocking his job, belittling his ambitions, complaining about money as if their entire life depended on his income. But what weighed on him the most was the realization that she no longer saw him as a partner, but as a target. A weakness to exploit when convenient. By noon, exhaustion swept over him, but he felt strangely clear. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about his biological parents without the usual fear of rejection. He wondered where he came from, who he looked like, whether they ever thought about him. He had always convinced himself it didn't matter. He had parents who raised him, loved him, and gave him a life. Digging into the past felt unnecessary. But now it felt necessary. Not because he wanted to replace anyone, but because Sarah had torn open a wound he never allowed himself to confront. He realized he needed answers, real ones. Not for her, not for the marriage, but for himself. That afternoon, Ethan searched online for agencies that specialized in reconnecting adoptees with their biological families. His hands shook slightly as he filled out the form, entering details he hadn't spoken aloud in years. His date of birth, the city where he was found, the small fragments of information his adoptive parents had given him when he turned 18. When he clicked submit, a wave of fear washed over him, followed by something unexpected, relief. For the first time, he felt like he was reclaiming a part of himself he had long avoided. He didn't know what he would find, or whether the journey would heal him or break him further. But one thing was certain. The search for his origins had begun, and there was no turning back. 2 weeks passed before Ethan heard anything back, and during that time he tried to bury himself in work. But every night felt the same. He lay awake, wondering if the agency would find anything, wondering if he'd made a mistake by opening a door he couldn't close again. When his phone finally rang one early afternoon, he froze at the sight of the unfamiliar number. His heart pounded so loudly, he almost didn't hear himself answer. On the other end, a calm, steady voice introduced himself as Michael Reyes, the investigator assigned to his case. Ethan felt his palms dampen as he listened. Michael explained that he had located records that matched Ethan's birth details. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. He had spent his entire life imagining this moment, but never truly believed it would happen. He forced out a shaky breath and asked the question he feared the most. Are they alive? There was a pause. A long, heavy pause that felt like someone pressing a hand against his chest. Then Michael spoke gently, carefully. Both of Ethan's biological parents had passed away. His mother 8 years ago, his father 5. Their deaths were not connected. Life had simply taken them at different times. Ethan didn't cry at first. He only felt numb, like someone had unplugged him from his own body. He whispered a quiet, "I understand," even though he didn't. He didn't understand anything. He didn't understand why he felt grief for people he had never met. He didn't understand why the ache in his chest felt so sharp, so sudden, so real. But Michael wasn't finished. He explained that Ethan's parents had never forgotten him. They had filed multiple inquiries, left notes in registries, even attempted to hire a private investigator decades earlier. They had kept searching until their health declined. Ethan closed his eyes and felt the first tear slip down his cheek. The investigator went on, saying that Ethan's parents had left behind a will. A legal document naming their son, Ethan, with his birth date and adoption details, as the sole inheritor of everything they owned. They had owned a modest house in a quiet town, along with a savings account they had built over the years. But the part that struck Ethan the hardest was a small box of keepsakes they had prepared for him. Letters, photographs, tiny possessions they believed he might want if they ever found him again. Michael told him the box had been stored safely, untouched. He could collect it whenever he was ready. Ethan wiped his face, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't articulate. These were strangers by blood, yet they had cared for him deeply enough to leave behind their last remnants of love. He hadn't been abandoned. He hadn't been unwanted. He had been lost. And now a part of him had finally been found. Before the call ended, Michael asked if Ethan would like to schedule a meeting to go over everything in person. Ethan agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, he sat alone in the quiet room, staring at the wall as the truth settled over him like a heavy blanket. His past wasn't a void anymore. It had names, memories, and love attached to it. And even though he could never meet them, he finally knew that his story mattered to someone long before he understood it himself. Sarah found out about the inheritance on a day when Ethan least expected it. He had been sitting at the dining table, quietly reviewing documents Michael had given him during their meeting. He thought Sarah was still out running errands, but she walked in earlier than he anticipated. She glanced at the papers, and curiosity turned into suspicion almost instantly. Before Ethan could put everything away, she reached across the table and picked up a page. Her eyes widened at the sight of the words estate, property, and beneficiary. Then she looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in years, a mixture of shock, excitement, and something greedier lurking beneath. Ethan didn't want this conversation yet, but the moment had already arrived. He explained what he could, keeping his voice steady and calm. He told her about Michael's call, about his biological parents, about the years they spent searching for him. To his surprise, Sarah didn't react with empathy or sadness over the loss of the people who created him. She reacted to one thing only. The money. "How much is it?" she asked, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her tone wasn't gentle, curious, or supportive. It was sharp and urgent, like she needed the answer right away. Ethan felt something sink inside his chest, but he gave her a rough estimate. Her expression changed immediately. The anger she'd been holding onto for days vanished almost magically. Her face softened, her voice sweetened, and she reached for his hand with a tenderness that felt completely foreign. "Ethan, this could change everything for us," she whispered. He didn't respond. He could feel the shift in her demeanor, the sudden warmth she hadn't shown him in months. She kept talking, painting pictures of a fresh start. Paying off debts, remodeling the house, going on trips they could never afford, finally living the life she believed they deserved. But every word she said made Ethan more uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that none of this was about family, healing, or understanding what he had just discovered about his past. It was about opportunity. Her opportunity. Later that night, she cooked his favorite meal for the first time in years. She kissed his cheek, sat beside him on the couch, wrapped her arm around him, and told him she was proud of him for reconnecting with his roots. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He recognized the tone she used. He recognized the calculation in her eyes. Sarah wasn't trying to rebuild their relationship. She was trying to secure her share of something that didn't belong to her. When he mentioned that the inheritance was legally considered separate property, she stiffened for a split second. Then she quickly recovered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said quietly, "that's something we can figure out together." The words sent a chill through him. Because it was the first moment Ethan realized she wasn't just interested in the money. She was planning around it. And underneath her sudden affection, he sensed an intent that made his stomach twist, an intent to take control of something she had no right to claim. From that night forward, their home no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a negotiation he never agreed to join. Sarah's shift in behavior didn't just stop at sweetness. It evolved into something far more unsettling. At first it was small things, subtle changes Ethan tried to brush off. She started asking about the bank statements more often, pretending she was trying to organize their finances. She offered to help him open a new account for the inheritance, insisting it would be easier for both of them if she had access too. Ethan declined politely, but her smile faltered every time he did. Soon the subtlety disappeared. Sarah began calling him repeatedly while he was at work, demanding to know where he was, what he was doing, and who he was speaking to. Her tone wasn't worried. It was controlling. One afternoon, his manager pulled him aside to let him know Sarah had phoned the office 3 times in less than an hour, claiming it was an emergency. There was no emergency. She simply wanted to make sure he wasn't hiding anything. Ethan felt embarrassment crawl up his neck, mixed with a growing sense of dread. That night, he confronted her, telling her she needed to stop. Instead of apologizing, she turned the situation on him, accusing him of being secretive, of shutting her out, of making her worry. But the worst part came when she tried to contact Michael, the investigator. Ethan discovered this when Michael called him with concern, saying Sarah had attempted to obtain private details about the estate and the financial documents. She claimed to be acting on Ethan's behalf, but her questions were invasive. How much exactly was in the savings account? How soon Ethan would take possession of the house? Whether there were other assets not listed yet? When Ethan confronted her about it, she didn't deny the attempt. She simply crossed her arms and said she deserved to know because she was his wife. Her entitlement was growing into something more volatile each day. A week later, he caught her trying to unlock his phone while he was in the shower. She didn't even look guilty. She insisted she was checking something because she had a bad feeling he was hiding money from her. That was the moment something inside Ethan snapped. He realized she no longer saw him as a partner, but as an obstacle between her and the inheritance. Her affection was gone, replaced by manipulation dressed up as concern. Her apologies were empty, her promises rehearsed, her tears carefully timed. He felt like he was living with a stranger, one who studied his moves, tracked his habits, and planned around his weaknesses. The final push came the night he found her rummaging through his home office, digging through drawers and folders, searching for documents she had no right to see. When she realized he was standing behind her, she didn't look startled. She looked irritated, as though he had interrupted something important. That expression terrified him more than anything. He knew then that whatever trust they once had was long gone. And if he stayed, she would only escalate. The inheritance wasn't just a temptation to her. It had become an obsession. With a steady breath and shaking hands, Ethan made the decision he had avoided for far too long. He would file for divorce. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Now. Ethan filed for divorce early on a Monday morning, choosing the quietest hour at the courthouse so he wouldn't have to face unnecessary questions or stares. When he walked out with the stamped documents in hand, he felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief because he was finally taking control of his life. Fear because he knew Sarah wouldn't let go easily. He didn't have to wait long to see how right he was. Sarah erupted the moment the papers were delivered to her. She called him nonstop, leaving voicemails filled with anger, insults, and accusations that shifted from one extreme to another. In one message she sobbed, begging him to reconsider. In the next, she screamed that he was a liar who had been planning to run away with her share of the money. When Ethan blocked her number, she turned to social media. Within hours, she posted long paragraphs painting herself as the abandoned wife whose ungrateful husband had hid a fortune and suddenly decided he didn't want a family anymore. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives reached out to Ethan, confused and concerned. He didn't defend himself publicly. He knew better than to argue in a place built for drama. But Sarah went further. She began messaging his coworkers, implying he was unstable. She tagged his workplace in angry posts. She contacted his parents, claiming he was being manipulated by outsiders. The chaos she unleashed was exhausting, but it ultimately backfired when the legal process began. Once lawyers were involved, the truth unfolded piece by piece. Ethan's attorney presented timestamps, call logs, and even some of the threatening voicemails Sarah had left. Every attempt she had made to access his bank accounts without permission became part of the record. Her calls to Michael were documented. Her online posts, filled with contradictions, helped prove her attempts at manipulation and defamation. Most importantly, the inheritance laws were crystal clear. The estate from his biological parents was legally classified as Ethan's separate property, not marital property. Sarah had no claim to it. Her attorney tried to argue emotional contributions, marital expectations, and financial hardship, but the evidence of her behavior overshadowed everything else. What she thought would be her leverage became her downfall. The judge questioned her aggressive actions, her attempts at financial intrusion, and her public attacks on Ethan. In the final hearing, Sarah looked strained, her confidence gone. She avoided Ethan's eyes as the judge ruled in his favor. No share of the inheritance, no access to his accounts. And because of her documented harassment, the court granted Ethan additional protective provisions regarding communication. Sarah left the courtroom shaking, furious, and defeated. Ethan remained seated for a long moment, letting the verdict sink in. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel proud. He felt drained. The cost of the marriage, the arguments, the manipulation, it all settled on his shoulders at once. But beneath that exhaustion was something stronger. A sense of closure. The war Sarah had started was finally over, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the faint outline of peace forming in the distance. Ethan didn't know what healing would look like after everything ended. The silence that followed the divorce felt unfamiliar at first, almost too quiet, as if he had stepped into a life that didn't belong to him. But in that quiet, he found space to breathe. He spent the first few weeks sorting through the belongings he had been avoiding, including the box Michael had given him from his biological parents. He placed it on the kitchen table one evening, hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside were letters wrapped in a faded ribbon, photographs carefully preserved, and small objects that seemed ordinary yet carried the weight of decades. He opened the letters one by one, reading the words written by two people he would never meet, but who had loved him long before he understood what love could mean. They wrote about hope, regret, and dreams they never set aside. They described the day he was born, the joy he brought into their lives, and the heartbreak of losing him because of circumstances they couldn't control. Each letter felt like a bridge across time, connecting him to a history he had always feared was empty. He cried more than he expected, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming realization that he had been cherished from the beginning. As the days passed, Ethan made the decision to sell the house he inherited. It wasn't because he wanted to erase his parents' memory, but because he needed a fresh start, one built on stability and intention. He used part of the proceeds to pay off lingering debts, then invested the rest with careful guidance. For the first time in years, his future didn't feel uncertain. He began therapy, something he had postponed for far too long. There, he learned to untangle years of emotional neglect, resentment, and fear that had accumulated inside him. He confronted the guilt he carried about his adoption, the insecurity that Sarah had amplified, and the belief that he had to endure unhappiness to deserve companionship. Therapy didn't fix everything instantly, but it gave him tools he never had before. He started volunteering occasionally, drawn to community programs supporting foster youth and adoptees. Talking to teenagers who felt lost in the system reminded him of himself at that age, confused, afraid to ask questions, afraid to hope. He realized he wanted to do more. Months later, he created a small scholarship fund, naming it after both his biological parents and his adoptive parents. It was his way of honoring all four of them, the ones who raised him and the ones who never stopped loving him despite the distance. A year after the divorce, Ethan looked around at his life and barely recognized the man he had been. He lived in a new apartment filled with sunlight, surrounded by plants he finally learned how to keep alive. He cooked more, slept better, and allowed himself to trust people again. He even started seeing someone new, a kind, patient woman named Claire who never rushed him, never pushed, and never tried to fill spaces that weren't hers. With her, everything felt gentle. Everything felt earned. One evening, while sitting on his balcony, Ethan realized something he had been too overwhelmed to notice earlier. He wasn't defined by the hurt Sarah caused him. He wasn't defined by the questions of his past. He was defined by the love that had followed him throughout his life, even when he didn't recognize it. And for the first time, he felt whole. Sarah drifted out of Ethan's life, almost as abruptly as the chaos she created. A few months after the divorce, he heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved in with someone new and was expecting a child. The news didn't sting the way he once imagined it would. Instead, it felt distant, like a chapter from a book he no longer needed to reread. Ethan didn't wish her harm, but he no longer wished for anything connected to her at all. His world had shifted into something calmer, clearer, shaped by choices that finally belonged to him. He spent more time visiting the places his biological parents once lived, learning about their lives through the people who remembered them. He kept their letters in a wooden box beside his bed, a reminder of the love that had waited for him across years of uncertainty. Walking through a quiet park one afternoon, he realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. It settled into him gently, without ceremony, like sunlight warming the ground after a long storm. Ethan knew his journey wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time, he moved forward with gratitude for every person who had truly loved him, all four parents who shaped him in ways he finally understood.